Hey everybody, welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. We are live here on TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and I think Instagram. My name is Leilani and I am the host of this vlogcast. This is how we grow. But tonight we are picking up where we left off yesterday, which is our book club, right? So we pick a book, we complete a book together, and then we move on to the next book. And the last few books that we've done have been part of the Spiritism Codex series written by Allan Kardec. And we are on book number 3, The Gospel According to Spiritism. Now, if you're joining me for the first time, do not worry. You can hang out. The information will not be lost on you. But if you do want to catch up, you can go to my YouTube channel at The Magical Solution to watch the first and second book series, which is the Spirits book and the Mediums book. Okay. Now, the information that we are talking about has everything to do with Spiritism, spiritualism, which I know is kind of like a hot new talking point, and it seems now that a lot of our occult, esoteric, magical, mystical, pagan-y traditions are now all starting to get lumped under the category of spiritualism and spiritism, which I find interesting because that must mean that the definition has changed. So I'm not really sure what that new definition of it is. So I'm going to go by the traditional definitions of spiritism and spiritualism. But overall, these books are very much about the practices of spiritism as defined by the spirit of truth, who was channeled by a medium and interviewed by Allan Kardec, in which he made this whole series. And so it's a very helpful codex. It's a very helpful beginning for people who are, just starting on this path, especially people who are interested in psychic mediumship, spiritism, brujeria, like any of those kinds of Caribbean and or European type mystic traditions usually have some tentacles within the Spiritist movement and vice versa. So, it's always just a great place to start. And it's also a very user-friendly place and a very open place for people because it's more of a philosophy and a way of life as opposed to a religion. And so you can be a Christian spiritist, and you can be a Buddhist spiritist, and you can be a Hindu spiritist. So it all kind of goes pretty beautifully together. And I think that's why it's such a friendly starting point. However, the origins and the beginnings of these series, as we know, with Allan Kardec and some of the other prominent authors of the time, there is a very deep, deep Christian language that is being used, and a lot of the Christian stereotypes that were had at that time. And let's not forget, we're also talking about the mathematics and the sciences of that time as well, archaeology, all that stuff of that time. So it's going to be a little dated. So just be patient with that as we move forward and try your best to pick out the useful information where you can. So, The Gospel According to Spiritism, this book is basically Spiritism's perspective on the Bible and on Jesus's teachings, specifically Jesus's teachings. So what they'll do is they'll take certain quotes from the Bible that Jesus had said, or that, was spoken about Jesus in particular, and they will pick it apart from the perspective of spiritism. And I don't mean pick it apart as in discredit it. I mean, they add validation to those phrases in a positive way from the perspective of spiritism. So hopefully that made sense and we can get into it. We are now on chapter 15. And the title of this chapter is Without Charity, There Is No Salvation. That is the title of this chapter. The subcategories within this chapter is what is needed in order to be saved, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the greatest commandment, the need for charity according to St. Paul, Without the church, there is no salvation, and without the truth, there is no salvation. And then, of course, the Spirit's teachings, which is without charity, there is no salvation. All right, so let's get to it. What is needed in order to be saved? Parable of the Good Samaritan. So we're going to pick out this quote, and the quote comes from Luke 10:25 to 37. Here we go. Now, when the Son of Man comes in his majesty, accompanied by all the angels, he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the peoples bring gathered before him. He will separate them from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left hand. Then the king will say to those who are on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take possession of the kingdom that has been prepared for you since the beginning of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was in need of shelter, and you sheltered me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to see me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you to eat, or thirsty and gave you to drink? When was it that we saw you without a shelter and sheltered you, or without clothes and clothed you? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and came to visit you?" And the king will respond to them, "Verily I say to you, as often as you did it on behalf of the least of my brothers, it was to me that you did it." Next, to those who are on the left, he will say, "Away from me, you who are accursed. Go to the eternal fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you did not give me to eat. I was thirsty, and you did not give me to drink. I needed shelter, and you did not shelter me. I had no clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then these two will reply, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or without shelter or sick or in prison, and we failed to help you?" But he will respond to them, "Verily I say to you, as often as you failed to render this assistance to one of the least of these, you failed to do it to me." And they will go to eternal punishment, and righteous to the eternal life. So that was Matthew 25:31 to 46. And then this next part is, I believe it was Luke. Yeah, okay. Then a doctor of the law stood up and said to him in order to test him, "Teacher, what must I do to possess eternal life?" And Jesus answered him, "What is it that is written in the law? What have you read in it?" He responded to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said to him, "You have answered well. Do so, and you shall live." However, wanting to appear to be righteous, the man said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answering said to him, "A certain man was coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of thieves, who stripped him of his clothes, covered him with wounds, and left him half dead. Afterward, it was just so happened that a priest was coming down by the same way, and having noticed him, passed him by on the other side. A Levite, who also came to the same spot, saw him, but passed by on the other side. But when a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came to where the man was and saw him, he was touched with compassion. He approached him and poured oil and wine on his wounds and bandaged them. And putting him on his own horse, he took him to an inn and cared for him. The following day, he took 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of this man, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I return." Which of these 3 seems to you to have been the neighbor of the one who had fell into the hands of the thieves? The doctor of the law responded to him, "The one who showed compassion on him?" And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So now that we've quoted the piece, or now that the book has quoted this piece, now we're going to see how Spiritism interprets this message from Jesus and how it validates it from the perspective of Spiritism. Okay? So all of Jesus's morals are summed up in charity and humility, the two virtues contrary to selfishness and pride. In all his teachings, he points to these two virtues as being the way to eternal happiness. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he said, meaning the humble, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the meek and the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. Love your neighbor as yourself, and do unto others what you want them to do unto you. Love your enemies. Forgive offenses if you yourself want to be forgiven, and practice the good without ostentation. Judge yourselves before you judge others. Humility and charity are the things Jesus never ceased to recommend, and of which he himself gave the example. Pride and selfishness are the things he never ceased to combat. But he did more than recommend charity. He put it in clear and explicit terms as an absolute condition of future happiness. In the picture that Jesus portrays of the final judgment, it is necessary, as in many other cases, to separate symbol from allegory. To people such as the ones to whom he spoke, who were still incapable of understanding purely spiritual matters, he had to present physical imagery that was striking and capable of impressing them. To be better accepted, he could not depart very far from the form of the current established ideas, always reserving for the future the true interpretation of his words and the points that he could not explain clearly at the time. However, alongside the supplementary and figurative part of the picture, one idea predominates: the happiness awaiting the righteous and the unhappiness reserved for the wicked. In the final judgment, what will be taken into consideration in the passing sentence? Upon what will the indictment be based on? Will the judge ask if one has fulfilled this or that formality or observed such and such outward practice? No. He will ask about one thing only: the practice of charity. And in passing sentence, he will say, "You who assisted your brothers and sisters, go on the right, and you who were harsh towards them, go to the left." Will he inquire as to the orthodoxy of their faith? Will he make a distinction between who believes in one manner and those who believe in another? No, for Jesus places the Samaritan, regarded as a heretic, but who showed love toward his neighbor, above the Orthodox person who lacks charity. Jesus thus did not make charity only one of the conditions for salvation, but the sole condition. If there were other conditions to fulfill, he would have mentioned them. If he places charity on the first plane of the virtues, it is because charity implicitly entails all the others: humility, kindness, benevolence, indulgence, justice, etc. And because it is a complete negation of pride and selfishness. Whew. Now, just to remind everyone, if you guys have questions along the way, or if you have opinions along the way, throw them into the chat. I will get to them when I'm done reading. Now we're on the next subcategory, which is the greatest commandment. And he is going to quote Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40. But having found out that he had put the Sadducees to silence, the Pharisees got together, and one of them, who was a doctor of the law, came to ask this question of him in order to test him. "Master, what is the greatest commandment of the law?" And Jesus replied, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. That is the greatest and first commandment. And here's the second, which is similar to that one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. All the law of the prophets are contained in these two commandments. End quote. I mean, honestly, if you were an outsider reading just Jesus's words and nothing else, that phrase right there, I think really sums it up. I mean, like that's pretty much what he said. He said what he said. And I think that's why it's just so difficult for a lot of us to wrap our minds around fanatical Christian ideology that promotes violence and promotes, uh, eradication and discrimination and all that stuff. Because it's just like, what? What Jesus were you listening to? Like, what? you know? Although he did say some other pretty wild shit too, but we'll get into that some other time. Okay, so now that we've read that quote, this is what Spiritism's interpretation of that is, okay? So charity and humility, that is the sole path to salvation. Selfishness and pride, that is the path to perdition. This principle is formulated in precise terms in these words: you shall love God with all of your soul and your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets are contained in these two commandments. And so that there may be no mistake about the interpretation of loving God and one's neighbor, Jesus adds, and this is the second commandment, which is similar to the first. That is, one cannot truly love God without loving one's neighbor, nor can one love one's neighbor without loving God. And thus, everything that is done against one's neighbor is also done to God himself, against God himself. And since one cannot love God without practicing charity towards one's neighbor, all of humankind's duties are summed up in the maxim, without charity, there is no salvation. So now Spiritism is going to interpret this idea of charity according to St. Paul, right? Because we know in the history of Christianity, there were prophets, there were individuals who wrote the Bible many, 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 many years after Jesus' death, if we believe that he is a real person. And so Paul was one of the main influencers of Christianity. As a matter of fact, there's a joke that goes around in religious scholar groups that says that it's not Christianity, it's Paulianity. And so we're gonna pull a quote here from St. Paul regarding this idea of charity and see what the Spiritists have to say about that. So here's the quote, and it comes from 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1-7. And I think that was it. The way that they wrote it here was weird. Okay. Even if I were to speak all the languages of men and the languages of the angels themselves, if I did not have charity, I would be only like a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I were to have the gift of prophecy and grasped all the mysteries, and if I had a perfect knowledge of all things, and if I had all the faith possible to the point of moving mountains, if I did not have charity, I would be nothing. And if I were to distribute my belongings to feed the poor and delivered my body to be burned, if I did not have charity, none of this would have made any use to me. Charity is patient. It is kind and benevolent. Charity is not envious. It is not rash or reckless. It is not full of pride. It is not scornful. It does not look after its own interests. It does not take offense or become upset by anything. It does not suspect evil. It does not rejoice in injustice, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes for all things, and it endures all things. Now, these three virtues remain: faith, hope, and charity. But among them, the most excellent is charity. So here we see now, according to Spiritism, the introduction of faith, hope, and charity, which is one of the cornerstone uh, uh, pieces of Spiritist ideology and principles. Okay. So, like this necklace, for example, is a picture of the cross, the anchor, and the heart. And this represents faith, hope, and charity as a symbol. And you will see a lot of espiritistas and a lot of spiritists sporting the faith, hope, and charity little tag, you know. Now, let's interpret this. Okay. So, St. Paul understood this great truth so profoundly that he said, even if I were to speak the language of the angels themselves, if I were to have the gift of prophecy and grasped all the mysteries, if I had all the faith possible to the point of moving mountains, but did not have charity, I would be nothing. Among these virtues, faith, hope, and charity, the most excellent is charity. So, without any doubt, he places charity above faith itself because charity is within everyone's reach. And the ignorant and the learned, the rich and the poor, and because it is independent of any particular belief system, he does even more. He defines true charity. He shows that it is not only displayed in beneficence, but in the gathering of all the qualities of the heart, in goodness and benevolence toward one's neighbor. So now we're on the next subcategory of this chapter, which is entitled, Without the Church, There is No Salvation, and Without Truth, There is No Salvation. So while the maxim, without charity, there is no salvation, is based on a universal principle that gives all God's children access to supreme happiness, the dogma, without the church, there is no salvation, is based upon a fundamental faith in God and the immortality of the soul, a faith common to all religions, but upon the special faith in particular dogmas, it is exclusive and absolute. Instead of uniting God's children, it divides them. Instead of stirring them to love their brothers and sisters, it maintains sanctions and sanctions the strife among the sectarians of various denominations, which mutually regard one another as damned for all eternity, even though they might be relatives and friends in this world. So, but by misunderstanding the great law of equality before the grave, it separates people from one another, even in the realm of repose. So the maxim, without charity there is no salvation, is consecrated to the principle of equality before God and freedom of conscience. With this maxim as a rule, all men and women are brothers and sisters, and whatever may be the way in which they worship the Creator, they hold out their hands to one another and pray for one another. With the dogma, without the church there is no salvation, they anthematize one another. They persecute one another, and they live as enemies. The Father does not pray for the Son for the Father, or the friend for the friend, if they believe each other to be condemned forever. Therefore, this dogma is essentially contrary to the teachings of Christ and the law of the gospel. Without the truth, there is no salvation would be equivalent to without the church, there is no salvation, and would be equally exclusive because there is no one single denomination that does not claim to be privileged with the truth. What person could boast of possessing the whole truth when the circle of knowledge is increasing constantly and ideas are being rectified each and every day? The absolute truth is shared only among spirits of the highest order, and earthly humankind could not pretend to belong to that order because it has not been given. It's not been given to it to know everything. Humans can aspire only to a relative truth that is proportional to their advancement. Listen to that closely. Humans can aspire only to a relative truth that is proportional to their advancement. We said that in the first book, we said that in the second book, and we're hearing it again in the third book. This is why this idea of the advancement of the moral and intellectual bodies within us determines how close we can get to truth, how close we can get to higher order spirits, and how close we can get to elevating our own spirit, right? I appreciate you too, honey. I'm glad. Ooh, tell me what you're cooking. If God had made possessing the whole truth as an express condition for future happiness, this would be a sentence of general proscription. Whereas all may practice charity, even in its broadest definition. In accordance with the gospel, Spiritism says that one can be saved, whatever one's belief may be, provided one observes God's laws. It does not state that without Spiritism there is no salvation. And since it does not claim as yet to teach the whole truth, neither does it state without truth there is no salvation. A maxim that would divide instead of unite and would perpetuate antagonism. So, boom, this is where your girl over here gets a little tight when I start to see very, very like fanaticalized and evangelized spiritists out here. Like the real hardcore, like by the book spiritists that are like really like staunch about this thing, and they've turned it much more into a religion than it is a philosophy or a way of life, because what ends up happening is this little maxim right here that Spiritism is warning us against is the exact maxims that they hold dear, which is that they have the truth about Spiritism, and that it is, and that without it there's no salvation, and that without Spiritism themselves, specifically the Spiritism that they practice, there's no salvation. So it can get really dicey really fast depending on who you associate it with within the Spiritist community. So now we are on the last part of chapter 15, which is the Spirit's teachings. So this is the part of the chapter where the Spirit themselves, he picks a spirit from history. Usually they try and pick a spirit that was around at the time that this maxim was talked about. Usually, but we can't make any promises. But anyway, this is the opportunity for them to speak to a spirit and get their perspective on this. So the spirit that they chose was, of course, the Apostle Paul. And they got this message from the Apostle Paul in Paris in 1860. And the Apostle Paul speaks about without charity, there is no salvation. That is the title of his section. My children, the destinies of men and women on earth and in heaven are contained in this maxim. Without charity, there is no salvation. On earth, because in the shadow of this banner, they will live in peace in heaven, because those who have practiced it will find grace before God. This motto is the heavenly light, the luminous pillar that guides them through the desert of life in order to lead them to the promised land. It shines in heaven like a saintly halo around the heads of the elect, and on earth it is engraved on the hearts of those to whom Jesus will say, "Go to the right, you who are blessed of my Father." You will recognize them by the fragrance of charity that they spread around them. Nothing expresses Jesus' thought better. Nothing sums up the duties of men and women better than this maxim of divine order. Spiritism could not prove its origin in any better way than by providing it as a rule, because it is the reflection of the purest type of Christianity. With such a guide, people will never become lost. So, my friends, apply yourselves to grasping its profound meaning and consequences, and to discovering for yourselves all its applications. Submit all of your actions to the test of charity, and your conscience will respond to you. Not only will it help you to avoid wrongdoing, but it will lead you to practice the good, for a negative virtue is not enough. It is necessary to have an active one. In order to practice the good, the action of the will is always necessary. Whereas in order not to practice wrongdoing, idleness and negligence are often enough. My friends, give thanks to God who has allowed you to enjoy the light of Spiritism, not because those who possess this enlightenment are the only ones who will be saved, but because in helping you to understand Christ's teachings more fully, it makes you better Christians. Therefore, make every effort so that when others observe you, they can say that the true Spiritist and the true Christian are one and the same. For all who practice charity are Jesus' disciples, whatever the denomination they belong to. So that was a quote from St. Paul. Now, I want to go back to a part that he talks about that I feel needs to be repeated, okay? In order to practice good, the action of the will is always necessary. Whereas, in order not to practice wrongdoing, idleness and negligence are often enough. My mother used to tell me as a child that boredom is the devil's playground, right? Idle hands are the devil's playground. And again, it's one of those things that, you listen to as a kid and you're like, what the hell does that mean? Does she just want me to stay busy and get out of her way? But the reality is just that. It's do good, stay busy doing and being good. Because when you stay busy doing these things and engaging in all the various types of charity that there are, there's no room. There's no room for idleness. There's no room for negligence. There's no room for laziness. There's no room for depression. There's no room for the harmful energies to seep in. So in a way, by doing this, you're protecting yourself, right? And you're giving yourself good karma. You're giving yourself good juju. You're creating an environment of attraction, of like attracts like. So the good that you do, good comes to you. So you start to get blessed more and more. The relationships in your life start to improve. Your connection with spirits, your connection with ancestors, your connection with your divine beings start to get stronger and more clear and more discerning. There's so many benefits in participating in this idea of charity. So do it. All right. So it is only 7:30. I'm already done with the chapter. Let me see how long this next chapter is. Nope, this next chapter is pretty long. So we'll save that for another day. So now the floor is open for questions. Let me see what you guys have. Let me scroll back. Oh my goodness. I love, 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 love when people, are doing chores, cooking, cleaning, and listening to the podcast. It's brings me so much joy. It really, really does. It just goes to show, like, you don't have to sit here and be like fully 1000% attentive with like a little notebook and a pen and like, I mean if that's what you do, whatever floats your boat. But I hope that whatever way you process, you've learned it and you do that. And some people like to process by keeping their hands busy and keeping their body busy while they listen. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful. Mary Thompson, works of mercy is what I call them. So acts of charity or works of mercy. I like that. Works of mercy. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. You're going to have to break that down for me though. Right? And the same thing with charity too. Like, it's interesting because these words are really loaded. They're really, really loaded. And a lot of times they come from places of privilege. So like this idea of charity, this idea of mercy, right? It kind of implies that you're coming from a place of better than, right? Like I'm doing this charity for someone because I can. Same thing with mercy. It's like this idea of like I do this out of mercy. I feel bad for them. I feel, whatever. And when that happens, when you start to think of these words from that headspace, it becomes it becomes about you and not about the person you're doing the service for. And that's a problem. You always want to take yourself out of that equation when you're of service to someone because it's not about you. Now, what it is about is that beautiful mutual energetic exchange that occurs, right? So that is something that is about you, but in a collaborative kind of way, not so much in a all about you kind of way. And you will see that and you will feel that when you engage in these practices. You'll feel the difference. You really will. Any more questions? Any more questions before we head out? Okay. Can you practice alone? Of course you can. Of course you can. Now, um, here's where working in groups and working with other mediums and other spiritists can be beneficial, right? Because any religious practice you essentially can do by yourself, because at the end of the day it's between you and spirit. There's nothing in this physical world that can tell you how and why or why not, right? That's all between you and spirit, right? But within spiritism and within espiritismo, working in groups is really really helpful because we understand the mechanics of energy. We understand the mechanics um of the different currents of energy and the different spirits and what they carry with them. And we learned that from the first book, the spirits book that we did. You can go to my YouTube channel and watch that. It breaks everything down. And as a matter of fact, I teach classes on this about spiritual anatomy, about really kind of understanding the mechanics of the spirit body and how it interacts with other spirits, right? And so when you know this information, the benefit of being in a group setting is that much more better. And here's why. So in a setting of spiritists or espiritistas, a couple of things will happen, right? There'll be things like healing, there'll be things like mediumship being done, there'll be things like, spirit removals and kind of like exorcisms, if you will. There'll be things like investigations being done, revelations. In some cases there'll even be mounting and channeling of spirits in a very big kind of way. And all of this stuff really, really helps the individual practitioner. Despite being in a group, everybody walks away from those experiences being healed, being moved, being enlightened, given light and progress, having learned something about themselves and having improved their mediumistic abilities as well. Your psychic mediumship abilities also get better when you spend time in these group settings and you practice, because just like anything else, it's a muscle, right? So yes, you can do it alone, but definitely don't discredit the benefits of doing it with a group. So if you can find one, I would encourage you to at least visit, right? Wonderful. Any more questions? Any more questions? Ooh, yummy. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to say thank you guys so much for hanging out with me tonight. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. And, just grow, keep growing, keep growing. And thank you so much for letting me be a part of your journey. And I hope to see you next time, next Sunday. We will be interviewing Deborah Lipp. She is the author of Bending the Binary, which is going to be a great subject to talk about during Pride Month. This particular subject is going to be about breaking the binary spiritual traditions when we're in a world where things are so fluid. How do we acknowledge the binary that is very, very traditional, right? How do we talk about these things and put them into context when we live in a world that is so fluid now? So we're going to be talking about gender. We're going to be talking about the LGBTQ community. We're going to be talking about duality and polarity within spiritual practices and how we can compensate for that. How can we be more inclusive with that? So make sure you join me on my YouTube channel, The Magical Solution, to watch that live Sunday, the 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right, guys, this is how we grow. Have a good night.